Hello everyone, my name is Javier Torres, as you can see on the screen, and I'm going to start thanking the organizing committee of the conference for allowing some of us to present our content online or sending a video recording. Without further ado, I'm going to start. My paper is titled Gender Binarism, Institutional Violence and Resistance in the English Studies University Classroom through Life Writing Analysis. This is a brief table of contents of what I'm trying to cover today. And I'm going to begin with this one, the classroom as a political space. So the university English studies classroom is rarely a neutral space. We see how cis heteronormative curricular frameworks and the systemic erasure of non-canonical figures from syllabi operate or function as a form of institutional violence. One that I argue, is seldom named, but let alone challenged. This proposal argues that the classroom is already a site of political reproduction. The question, however, is whose realities does the classroom render visible, and which ones does it silence? When a heteronormative curriculum selects which authors, bodies, and forms of desire are presented as legitimate or identities in general, it does more than excluding the rest. It actively organizes knowledge through norms that privilege some subjectivities while rendering others unintelligible or invisible. In this sense, institutional violence does not always appear as overt prohibition. It can also take the form of omission, normalization, symbolic absence, producing a classroom in which difference is managed rather than critically engaged with. And with the brief instruction, I'm covering, as I said, gender binarism in the classroom and also how to resist that gender binarism within the same classroom. So that gender binarism answers to the underlying notion of identity expression. We have seen how, and we see how this heteronormative curricula has rolled through the pedagogical erasure of figures out of the literary canon, as I've introduced, and this research focuses on establishing inclusive methodologies and developing teaching practices grounded in queer but also feminist thought. Now, resistance in this sense means moving beyond theory and confronting students with lived, embodied realities outside of such binarism. Critical thinking, room for debate, and empathy are the three main foundational pillars of this proposal. These will result in a transformation of the classroom into a space of intellectual and social resistance, providing students with the tools necessary to analyze and challenge systemic gender oppression within and outside of academia. Now, when we speak of institutional violence, what do we refer to? Well, four main ideas. We first have curricular erasure, as I've mentioned before, which is the systematic omission of LGBTQI plus authors, histories, and lived experiences from syllabus, canons, and classroom examples. And this produces an absence as an institutional rather than an accident. Now, when it comes to cis heteronormativity, it is a pedagogical regime that treats binary gender and heterosexuality as the default framework of intelligibility, organizing, connecting interaction and authority around normative bodies and also desires. When it comes to silencing or silence as the norm, the legitimization of queer lives or the silencing of these queer and trans lives and the knowledges and embodied experiences, even though at first we might appeal to neutrality, objectivity, or disciplinary rigor, well, this is positioning marginalized perspectives as secondary, anecdotal, or theoretically insufficient, and therefore silence stands as the norm, justified through a neutrality that is nothing but not neutral at all. And then structural and symbolic violence refers to, for example, for trans people, violence operates or functions through bureaucratic barriers, misrecognition, misgendering, and institutional practices that render its identity precarious, while also reinforcing stigma, exclusion, and social injury. Now, the methodology that I am using is applied theater in education. So the theory stands for applied theater as a methodology that transcends the conventional stage, using dramatic arts to facilitate the learning process, personal developing, and social transformation within diverse educational contexts. In this case, we're talking about university teaching. Now, the cycle is as follows, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. Applied theater is not just an artistic activity, but it's a different way of doing things that pushes for critical thinking, active participation, and has the power to transform communities and individuals. So thinking about the theatrical practice in a different way, and also outside of the usual theatrical space, which in this case is the classroom. And we also need a pedagogical definition for it. In this case, the methodology is participatory and it uses dramatic strategies to explore, understand, and tackle social, personal, and educational problems while fostering critical thinking and dialogue. We move on beyond the stage. Conventional theater is focused on a passive audience, while applied theater prioritizes the process over the product. And therefore, students or participants are also active creators, not just passive spectators or audiences, and such because they are involved in the action. Now, this has a transformational resistance element through communicative skills, critical thinking, and empathy, which are fostered in participants and makes it easier to explore identities, subvert norms, and propose solutions for social change. In this case, from the classroom towards the community, apart from the internal learning processes. When it comes to the critical intervention, and I'm talking about life writing examples, so what is life writing, or how can we understand life writing as a critical intervention? Well, whether if it is memoirs, essays, auto theory, testimonies, any form of life writing, it places embodied lived experience at the center of literary and critical analysis. Queer and trans life writing does not merely add diversity to the curriculum, it confronts audiences and students directly with the material realities of LGBTQIA+ lives: violence, survival, joy, and systemic inequality. These texts refuse abstraction. They insist that theory is always grounded in a body, or in the body. Now, when we talk about embodiment, embodied knowledge, and embodied narratives, I intend to argue that life narratives, including memoirs, essays, testimonies, and so on and so forth, are fundamental to understand the knowledge that comes from lived experiences. No mere personal narratives are these texts, but critical tools that intertwine subjectivity with politics against universal notions of truth and knowledge. For inclusive pedagogies, life writing is more than a way that just to diversify the curriculum. It's a fundamental critical pedagogy that reveals how power is enacted over the body. And so the proposal goes as follows, and it's built upon three main pillars, which are the ones that you can see on screen. These pillars work together as a single pedagogical, let's say, engine or machine. Critical thinking helps students with power and representation. Debate and dialogue turn the classroom into a shared space of inquiry. And also empathy grounds learning in embodied relation and ethical attention to others. In the methodology of applied theater, this combination becomes transformative because students do not only analyze ideas, they test them through their own voice. They have to use gestures, they embody a different role, they might have to improvise something, and all in all, it fosters collective reflection. And of course, there are different stages to this process. First of all, we need to provide a context that's going to be changing depending on the text that we're going to study, which we'll see I'll cover in a bit. So for the context, participants are involved in critical reading of the selected text and also its analysis along with the relevant topics at hand. Then we move on to the second stage, which is the creation. In this case, students need to transform an essay piece, or an essay into a monologue that embodies the perspectives and voices that we've worked in the classroom. Then we move on to the third stage, which is representation, which consists on an on-stage representation of the adaptation, offering a space for artistic expression and communication among students. And the last stage is critical, which involves feedback not only from the part of the teacher but also among peers, assessment and collaborative reflective debate on the creative process, and also underlying layers of content. Now, my practice in specifically consisted in participating through a monologue. So within applied theater, it becomes a powerful pedagogical tool because it reveals internal struggles, allows students for a deep exploration of conflicts, and it has a double enunciation. It also helps marginalized subjectivities to be placed to the front. Now, when it comes to theory and pedagogy, or theory and practice, this proposal is grounded in both queer theory and feminist thought. Drawing on their shared concern with power, the body, and the politics of knowledge together, they provide a critical lens for examining how norms are produced, how identities are regulated, and how classrooms can become spaces of recognition rather than exclusion. Queer theory, on the one hand, contributes to an analysis of normativity, performativity, and the instability of fixed categories, while on the other hand, feminist thought adds a sustained focus on intersectionality, embodiment, and situated knowledges. Now, read together or combined, these traditions complement and strengthen one another. Now, rather than treating these as competing frameworks or opposing frameworks, the approach brings them into productive dialogue. Now, what I intend to do is to inform concrete, replicable classroom methodologies that value plurality, diversity, and supports different subjectivities, and also make space for critical participation. In practice, this means designing learning environments that reduce barriers to belonging, encourage reflexive dialogue, and recognize that knowledge is always shaped by lived experience, power relationships, and also social contexts. Now, in terms of an inclusive methodology, first we've got three main things to cover: diversifying the syllabus, reflexive practices, and also the analytical framework. For the syllabus, to integrate queer and trans-authored life writing alongside canonical text is to show that literary tradition is not fixed or neutral. For example, we can pair a classic novel with an autobiographical essay, memoir, or poem by a queer or trans writer, and then add a short comparative prompt, such as how do these texts construct identity, belonging, or silence differently. In practice, this can also mean replacing a single universal reading with a list of thematic clusters. For instance, a unit on family that includes both canonical and marginalized voices, and asking students to identify whose experiences are centered and whose are omitted. When it comes to reflexive pedagogical practice, it is about building regular reflection into teaching so teachers can examine how our own assumptions shape classroom dynamics. A practical approach is to begin a unit with a short positionality statement, for example, or to use exit tickets that ask students which perspectives we are missing or which examples felt most relevant to them or to society. Now, teachers can also rotate discussion forms, monitor participation patterns, and revise reading selections after noticing or finding out who speaks most often, who is interrupted, which examples resonate with them and which don't. And so these small adjustments help make teaching more responsive, accountable, and inclusive over time. The analytical frameworks for gender, I intend to teach gender as a system of power by giving students tools to analyze how norms are produced in text, images, and everyday interactions. For example, we can use close reading questions such as who is assumed to be the default subject, which identities are treated as visible or defiant or unspoken, and what roles are gendered as natural. Students, for example, can apply these questions to classroom examples, media clips, or literary passages, and then discuss how language, narrative structure, and institutional rules reinforce or challenge this hierarchy. In turn, gender analysis into method students can be used to beyond the classroom, including in public discourse and civic life. The text in question that I've used is I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya, a memoir or essay piece from 2018. And there are four main elements in this text, which are also the reasons why I've selected this test for the class. First of all is the authorship. We've got an intersectional voice that amplifies marginalized lived experiences, fostering empathy. Then in the question of violence, it is a harsh exposure of the violence inherent in the cis heteronormative system towards queer and trans bodies and lives. When it comes to the process of applied theater and dramatization, it is fairly easy, or it's at least accessible and suitable for dramatization, and it can result in a representation in class because it's not a very long text. And last but not least, it's about embodiment. The text reflects lived and embodied experiences, which reinforces the idea that knowledge is not abstract. Now, of course, the key contributions here, we have got the curricular innovation. This proposal, in sum, introduces a concrete module designed for integrating queer and trans life writing into English studies through close reading, guided discussion, and comparative textual analysis. When it comes to the teaching practice, the proposal offers adaptable teaching strategies grounded in queer feminist pedagogy, such as seminar prompts, reflective writing exercises, collaborative interpretation, and discussion formats that encourage respectful dialogue. When it comes to social commitment, this contribution positions the university classroom as an active site of intellectual and social justice work by connecting academic learning to broader questions of equity, recognition, and institutional responsibility. Of course, these insights reminds us that education is never neutral. What we teach, how we teach, and whose voices we center shape the boundaries of imagination itself. When classrooms make room for marginalized histories, lived experiences, and critical questioning, they do more than just transmitting knowledge or teaching knowledge. They create the possibility for change. Now, I mean this in two ways: inside the institution and outside of the institution. What I mean by this is that, for example, we need to challenge cis heteronormative assumptions in literary analysis, essay writing, and disciplinary knowledge production, and also how we configure our own syllabus and curriculums. Now, within the classroom, resistance begins by questioning what counts as universal, and students and teachers can disrupt dominant narratives by reading against the grain, naming exclusions, and treating gender racialized experience as essential intellectual material rather than peripheral testimonies or additional readings. When it comes to beyond the institution, we can provide students with critical literacy to identify and resist systemic gender oppression in broader social and political contexts. This literacy, in terms of being critical, can then become action. Organizing discussion circles in community spaces, for example, challenging harmful language in peer groups, and so on and so forth. When the classroom, all in all, becomes a site of reflection and collective encouragement, it helps students imagine not only a different education, but also a different reality. And coming to the conclusions of my study, which is the proposal, I need to say a few things. So my intention is to argue that queer and trans life writing should be understood as a core intervention in English studies, not as just supplementary material. And this proposal has been grounded in applied theater methodologies, which enable students to inhabit questions of voice, embodiment, power, and recognition in ways that are materially and effectively transformative. All in all, I intend to propose that inclusive pedagogies are strongest when they combine textual analysis with applied theater practices such as role play, forum-based explanation, and reflective collaboration, or just the mere task of having to come up with a monologue based on the text, which in this case was I'm Afraid of Men. Now, these methods deepen critical rigor while also cultivating or fostering empathy, dialogue, and sharper awareness of the structure that produce exclusion. And last but not least, I also invite colleagues and practitioners or teachers and curriculum designers or artists to create classrooms where theory and practice can meet, where learning becomes an act of social change or imagination, and to use applied theater as a shared methodology for testing inclusive futures, in a sense of as a sort of rehearsal towards a more equitable relationship with the world, our peers, and so on, and also to build communities that are not only critical but communities that care. Now, that would be all. Thank you so much for your attention and for your time. On the screen, you can see my email. You're free to email me, get in touch with me about this topic or any other. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much.